Awesome. And we are live with Josh, founder of Astria. Josh, welcome. You're coming on an auspicious day, which is the 1 year anniversary of the Celestia mainnet launch last year. It's also Halloween. You don't seem to be wearing a costume though. Neither am I, but I will be later. Anyway, welcome, Josh. Why don't you give us a little background of yourself and Astria before we jump in?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Nick. Great to be here. Obviously, right, a very busy week for us, and exciting to get kind of the mainnet launch out, get Flame on top of that. Obviously, we had the Celestia 1 year anniversary. I think in Berlin, this time last year. Watching the big screen there as the network went live, and so that's a super exciting event. Just giving some kind of background and history on myself, right? So I've been in crypto almost 4 years now in like a full-time capacity, which feels like an eternity. But Astria really started my time at Celestia, right? I joined Celestia in November of 2021, so almost 3 years now. Maybe a couple weeks away from like 3 years ago.
That is wild, man. Time flies.
Yeah, no, that was crazy. And I think we met first actually at Solana Breakpoint in Lisbon, the first Solana Breakpoint, and that's actually kind of like useful context on kind of how I think about crypto and like what Astria is and like, why we think, the modular native or the Celestia native ecosystem is such like an important concept is, I was considering joining, Solana or trying to kind of find a job in the Solana ecosystem, Solana Labs. That's why I was at Breakpoint, or I was also considering kind of Celestia. And I picked Celestia, primarily because it was new, I think, was like my big reason, right? At this time, Solana was trading 250. It was a relatively large kind of organization. You had Solana Labs at 100 people, Breakpoint was a very high thing. And I wanted to do something new and say, like, what is the opportunity we have for like new stuff in the kind of crypto ecosystem from an infrastructure perspective? And I think Celestia has this great vision for like, kind of being more scalable. We're seeing, chatter on Twitter this morning where people saying, oh, Celestia is too cheap kind of thing. And I think that's a very kind of like, you did like this decel kind of adjacent mindset, right? To saying, like, oh my God, what happens if we have too much abundance, right? Like, what will we do with all of this kind of abundance? We need to be, price controlling and or like, restricting supply so that we have higher kind of pricing things rather than just like kind of having an abundance. And so I think really Celestia's view of like abundance in block space was like very motivational to kind of my origin of like joining Celestia and then Astria kind of coming out of that.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, well, we first connected when you were at Edge and Node, also known as The Graph, doing research. And I had a call with you, and you were the first person, or one of the few people at that time who had actually read and fully digested and understood both the DAS white paper as well as the Lazy Ledger white paper. And I was just blown away. And I was, then we met in person at Breakpoint, and the rest is history. But why don't you tell us a little bit more about like what Astria is? It's the first decentralized sequencing layer. I know you guys also have launched on top of Astria 2 native like roll-up applications, Forma and Flame. So give us a 10,000 foot view of like Astria, what you've built over the last 3 years, and the different applications that are running on top of it currently.
Yeah. So right. Astria started as, I guess, what was called like Sevmos. That is like the like ideological kind of like, predecessor was like this idea of Sevmos and like an EVM on top of Celestia. So this idea of like a Celestia native EVM, and we call it like a decentralized sequencing layer, and because we think it's important to like be conscious that there's like a layer, right? There is like there's like a physical representation of like a thing in between, right? It's not this like purely abstract thing. There is this like layer, the sequencing layer, and we use it because it does two things, right? It does kind of shared sequencing, but it also does, settlement. And when we say settlement in this context, I usually mean bridging. And this again goes back to this kind of like Sevmos day of, in 2022, the topic was around, settlement layers and Celestia having a settlement layer or doing, what was called enshrined settlement or enshrining a settlement layer. And so Astria largely comes out of kind of that discussion of, okay, we want to have kind of, settlement and bridging, and we want this native ecosystem. How is the TIA token? At the time we weren't even talking about like token then. That was like so early, right? But it was like, okay, what do we want this ecosystem to look at? What is kind of, the monetary exchange going to happen? We thought like, settlement was like a necessary component adding bridging. We wanted a separate layer. And then when we looked at that, we said, okay, the roll-ups that are kind of, at that time, right, that was pretty early in kind of roll-up roadmap there, they're all running these like centralized sequencers. And we looked at it and said, we don't really want those, to happen that way. And so relating this to kind of Forma and Flame, I have this picture, the first deck we sent out for like Astria in like May or June of 2022, it had this diagram in it where we had, Celestia and we had Astria. And then the idea was on top of that, where we put these rollups on top of it, we were calling them smart contract rollups to distinguish from sovereign rollups. And really we had like two main categories where we thought there were logical distinctions. We had like a DeFi rollup and we had like an NFT rollup. And actually the like labels we put in those, we put NFT in one rollup, and then we put literally like Uniswap and Aave in the other rollup, because to some degree, even then, and I think it continues now, the majority of DeFi is that. And so going to kind of the applications we've deployed, if we have Forma's not running on the Astria mainnet, it's on its own kind of distinct network right now, but using like the full Astria stack of stuff, and it still writes all of its data to Celestia mainnet. You can go see Selenium, and it has all that data there. And that's really our NFT focused chain, right? Very much kind of creator economy and focused on that. And we think kind of Forma's had, pretty great success, right? Obviously, it's like a hard time for like NFT projects generally, but, we've seen 3.9 million like primary mints on Forma, right? We've seen, $70,000 or 70,000 TIA of like primary volume on it. We've seen 38,000 secondary sales, so we see people like using this, interacting with the chain, which I think is great from it being this first kind of like, Celestia native chain, right? You use TIA as a gas token, right? All of the things are denominated in TIA and really kind of kickstarting that ecosystem. And then we also have Flame, which we launched yesterday, and very similar technically to Forma, and that's running, Astria Guest, which are a modification of Go Ethereum, using the Astria stack to communicate with like an Astria network and thus Celestia. But it's focused on DeFi. And again, going back to the origins, when we think DeFi, we really think kind of swaps and we think lending, right? And so right now we have swaps, we're working on lending. We've got to get an Oracle built in there, and then get a lending market. But right now we have swaps. And again, it's this, Celestia native DeFi ecosystem, denominating the chain's gas token in TIA, but also trying to build up kind of TIA as this kind of core asset to a DeFi ecosystem. And so the assets we have right now on that chain are, TIA itself, Stride staked TIA, Milky Way's Milk TIA, as well as USDC, because if we look at DeFi ecosystems, it's really the kind of core of these things is, these LSTs against a native asset pair, having deep liquidity in that, and then having the kind of core asset swapped against USDC. And that is the kind of primary core. So we're taking this kind of bottoms up approach, I think, of saying, what are the foundational elements of kind of an ecosystem, and build those first, and then expand into the kind of like more kind of like niche, I think, kind of targeted ecosystems.
Absolutely. And I'm actually a heavy Forma user. I've minted pretty much every single mint that's gone live. I haven't sold anything on secondaries. I'm a hodler. But the cool thing I remember when Astria launched was, it was the first like truly native Celestia app. Mints are done with TIA. The gas is paid in TIA. And also, if I recall correctly, it's technically a sovereign rollup, and it was kind of, I think the first of its kind. Sovereign rollups were like this idea, but no one had really built one in practice. And I think the cool thing for me when I used and I think for everyone, when they saw Forma live and they used it, they realized like, wow, actually, sovereign rollups, the UX is great, and we don't necessarily need this enshrined bridge. Like rollups can be kind of independent. There's not a need for this tie-in, and in fact, like, so I think like Astria has also been just a pioneer of that notion of sort of like sovereign rollups, but they're very functional.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've spent, so many years of my life, even going back to like, when I found Celestia, was like reading all the white papers and what is a rollup, right? And this has been a debate I've been a part of for like 3.5 years now, right? Of like, what is a rollup? Is it defined by the bridge? And I don't fall in the camp of like defined by the bridge. I think there's some like kind of more practical reasons why that narrative has kind of persisted. And I think actually like, without getting too much in the weeds, really a lot of it's like EVM driven. And what I mean by that is like fundamentally the EVM as like just like a piece of code, right? As like a protocol into its own. It has one concept of like a fee paying asset. That's like a core asset. Like there's no concept of like a denom in the EVM. It just has like an asset that is like the core fee paying asset that is not like labeled with an asset type. It's just like a number. And because of that, that's what led to a lot of the account abstraction work, because it's very hard to pay for gas on an EVM in more than one asset, right? It's very non-trivial. That's why I get these account abstraction. And what that led to is when you're building a rollup that is like an EVM-based rollup, you have to like pick which asset is your fee paying asset. And that's like a very difficult thing to change, and you don't have optionality. Whereas if you look in the more kind of Cosmos ecosystem space, right? If you look at like Osmosis and like Stride and a bunch of these other chains, fundamentally, it's not that hard to pay in multiple assets, including IBC bridged assets, right? It's not difficult. And so, on Astria, our fees are paid in like TIA, but it's IBC bridged TIA. So the actual asset denomination is this like IBC thing. It's like, channel 0 slash, it's like slash channel slash 0 slash like, UTIA or whatever like that, right? But we could change that to something else relatively trivially. So I think there's an interesting kind of like past dependency and limitation of like the EVM as an environment that led to everyone saying, oh my God, this enshrined bridge is like super, super important. Whereas if you kind of go into this, hey, the Ethereum people are like 2 years behind the Cosmos people or whatever on their designs, we're getting to this space. Yeah, exactly. Right. We've seen this happen, again, it's been 3.5 years, right? So many times, so many cycles. The idea of paying in multiple assets was like never a big discussion point in Cosmos, because it was just like, you can just do that. Like if you want to do that, you do that, right? It's not a difficult task. Whereas in Ethereum land, it's very difficult. So when we look at like sovereign rollups, right? I think it's this idea of saying like, people have the option to pay in kind of like what they want or what the chain wants them to pay in. That doesn't have to be something that is like, oh my God, I made this decision once and I'm never allowed to change my mind about the decision, right? It's mostly this kind of EVM constraint thing. And, I think we're seeing a lot of interesting attention in, Solana and SVM and MoveVM and generally like, alt VMs. I don't think we should necessarily use like alt VMs. I think it's like a little bit too much kind of clout maybe to the Ethereum people to say, oh, that's like the blessed, virtual machine. But I do think there's an interesting path dependency, but sovereign rollups, right? Again, like it's in the name, right? Sovereignty. I do think these rollups should fundamentally have a lot more control over what they're doing. And we shouldn't be trying to do, similar to this kind of decel thing, right? Oh, we've locked these people in. We've artificially constrained the supply so that the price is high. That's like the exact opposite of what you're doing, which is saying, if these people think this is the correct asset for them to use because it provides them the best benefits, ecosystem, politics, whatever, they should use that. But they shouldn't feel like they're forced to use that kind of against their will. And so that's the sovereignty thing, right? And we've seen discussion around application-specific sequencing be kind of similar to this, right? The apps and maybe it's like app chains. We want to give the people who are building in these ecosystems more control over what they want to build and not be artificially constrained. And again, that goes back to Celestia's overall abundance mindset.
Yeah. To me, sovereignty is about control and choice and giving the developers, the builders, the users the maximum, control over their application, because ultimately they are the people that matter. Without, users, without people actually building these things, like we don't have an ecosystem, we won't have anything essentially. So that comes down to the gas token, whether that comes down to the like sequencing and the MEV and the fees and the revenue and stuff, like all of that, I think should be ultimately controlled by the users and builders. And it's funny when you mentioned earlier about Sevmos and being a settlement layer, and I remember early on talking to some of the roll-up teams. This is like 2021 or even early 2022, the Ethereum roll-up teams, because that was all that kind of existed at that time. We tried to explain to them, the fact that you could build a roll-up without settlement on another chain, like another L1, and none of them really got it. They were just so stuck in this mindset of like, we need to, there needs to be an enshrined bridge. There needs to be a place where we post our proofs and things like that. And I think partly due to the fact that there was interactive verification games where like you kind of do need that. But now that we're in like a world, post OP succinct and with the progress of ZK, I just feel like there's no longer really a justification for that. So I'm excited to see Astria really, in my mind, kind of leapfrogging a lot of the infrastructure that's been built in other ecosystems to provide like really robust infrastructure for like this next generation of rollups. So getting more like specific, like what are some of the concrete features that Astria provides that, for example, you can't really find in other stacks or other ecosystems? Like I was reading your blog post. I know that your bridging is a big part of this. Like you get, when you deploy a rollup on Astria, you get bridging for free essentially with the Celestia base layer. fast confirmations. I don't know. Tell us a little bit more about like why Astria, like with the benefits that it provides.
Yeah, I mean, again, so a lot of the Astria thing, when we think about like the project, the core development, and like what we focused on, it's again similar to this kind of Celestia origin of saying like, hey, look, we're going to do things that aren't kind of just explicitly downstream of like the path dependency of like, I think a lot of the Ethereum settlement layer discussion is kind of the saying like, we have this like golden calf, and like every thought that goes through your mind must be kind of contextualized by like, we cannot harm the golden calf here. And that kind of like perverts your kind of thinking process. And so we wanted to go very, very first principles and say like, what are the things people are trying to do? What are the things they want, whether it's a rollup developer, whether it's user, whatever, right? And so one of the core things was like, single slot finality, right? We see a lot of discussion around this, right? Over like, how much of the code base of Optimism or Arbitrum or whatever is dealing with like forks, right? Fundamentally dealing with reorgs in like a forking environment is just an enormous pain point. And that was something that was very, very important for us to say. It's like, we're not going to deal with forks. We're not going to do a liveness bias thing. We're going to use CompBFT. We're going to have a safety bias thing, because the mental overhead and complexity of dealing with that is so hard. So when we have rollups using kind of Astria for their, you can call them like soft commitments, so we batch and post all of our data to Celestia, right? It's important that they get like single slot finality. They're not worrying about kind of rewards, and that provides us a much, much simpler, say like roll-up protocol, right? The node, the roll-up node, right? So like Flame is this like, roll-up node, but it doesn't have a sequencer of its own, right? It is in a, to use the Ethereum, kind of ecosystems terminology, Flame is a based roll-up of Astria's decentralized sequencing layer, in that it reads all of its data out of Astria. It doesn't have some other kind of input stream of data from some other sequencer. It's just deriving data and kind of contextualizing into its state machine there. And so we think it's important that people get decentralization by default out of the box, but that decentralization is also going to give you the single slot finality, right? So you can kind of have confidence in that, right? And the decentralization being important, I think there's been a lot of debate over like, do we care about that, right? To some degree, the market doesn't care, right? We've been running centralized sequencers for 3 years now. Clearly it's not kind of like a huge kind of concern from like users, but we think it's like an ideologically important thing. And one of the reasons why we thought it was necessary to launch with something that is kind of, I'll say architecturally decentralized, because I don't think like Astria is like politically decentralized. I think it's important that people are like aware of that, right? We're running a proof of authority network, right? We as like the core development team are running 4 out of the 11 validators. We have like 7 other validators. That's not a huge validator set, right? But it is giving us this decentralization at like an architectural level, and that it is like, we are doing a leader rotation, right? And the important thing about that is that anyone who builds on top of it is already having to kind of like day one confront that reality, because fundamentally decentralization is like, it's not that decentralization is the point of crypto, it's that decentralization is the thing that enables censorship resistance. And I still view like censorship resistance as the point of crypto. It's what makes a crypto app different from another app. It's like, we have this kind of like, this idea that there is like this like, trust minimized counterparty that you're dealing with, this protocol, right? And so you can have kind of 2 entities kind of like interacting with one protocol in like a trust minimized fashion. So the decentralization by having it day one, right? We use the term right now, like decentralized by default, means that anyone who builds on it doesn't have to think about that later, right? There, and to some degree, it's like a forcing function. So you're not allowed to think about that later if you build on this ecosystem, but also being able to demonstrate that like, it's not like a horrible trade-off, right? It's not like you're just like throwing out any reasonable user experience with it. You're still getting your single slot finality, right? On our mainnet right now, we're running like average 2.3 second block times, right? So we're in this competitive, kind of positioning to like a centrally sequenced Optimism roll up from a block time. And you're getting these kind of, fast finality, single slot guarantees, but that you don't have to say, oh, I'm going to go put, on my roadmap doc, my progressive decentralization, I will decentralize the sequencer at some unbounded unknown period in the future. And that's always just going to be down the roadmap as a P2. You have that day one. And that puts you in a much better position, we think, for kind of having a long-term kind of sustainable ecosystem. You're not half-assing it from the start, but also kind of it's a forcing function on us to make sure that, we're competing and we uphold kind of decentralization as this kind of like core thing that we're not going to give up. But we have to provide a competitive user experience rather than someone who's saying, hey, I have centralization. I have shortcuts I can take if I want to, short my block time. So I'll prioritize shortening the block time in a centralized fashion rather than, going to decentralization and then improving it. We just think it's kind of important to keep ourselves honest in that ecosystem, because that's the whole goal of we think, this industry.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And the way that we've started thinking about Celestia is as a platform for unstoppable applications. And unstoppable basically is another word for decentralized, right? And decentralized can mean a lot of things. To me, there's like 4 important parts. One is, needs to be verifiable by end users. It needs to have like strong sort of like settlement guarantees from consensus. And it needs to have censorship resistance and liveness. And I think like basically what you're saying is, well, a lot of the rollouts that are built today, if you're using a centralized sequencer, in a lot of ways, you're sacrificing that quality, and you're not truly unstoppable. You're an application with you're interacting as a user with an entity that actually has some degree of control over the system. And when you build on Astria, you get all those things by default. So it's like kind of unstoppable by default, which I think is very powerful. And like part of the thesis behind this is that, the most disruptive use cases for crypto and blockchain are things that, people are not going to want to see in the world necessarily. They're going to be people who are opposed to these things. Like a lot of people don't want free private money, for everyone to be able to pay each other. They don't want to see true end-to-end encryption like what Ryan is now building with Prism. There's just like all those things need to be built on infrastructure that can truly withstand, nation state level type of kind of opposition. And so anyway, I'm just very, very aligned with that. And like, we need more people to be building with this in mind, rather than this sort of like paper over, hey, this is like, a decentralized application, when actually like under the hood, it's a data availability committee and a centralized sequencer. And it's kind of like, okay, well, what's really going on here? And then to my knowledge, I don't think, are there any other rollups that have decentralized sequencers? I mean, there are some based rollups on Ethereum, maybe one, but
I would count Tycho and Metis has at least, they've stated they're like a decentralized sequencer. Metis, I feel like, not to like drag them or anything, but like they're somewhat out of the kind of discussion here, right? They're not kind of put in like the kind of broad range of like, I don't know what you would call like the kind of dominant, rollups we look at base, Arbitrum, Starkware, Optimism, et cetera, et cetera. But they claim to have a decentralized sequencer. I think it's like loosely based around like a Polygon POS kind of fork or something like that. So I'm not that familiar. And then obviously like Tycho is like a base rollup, right? But I know Tycho is also working on like another network that's doing something like precons or whatever, something like that. But I do think it's like relatively novel. And there's also a question of like kind of the prioritization level, right? And what I mean by that is like, when we think about, being Celestia native or being sovereign, right? I think it's important to think about like, what are the priorities of the organization or the ecosystem, right? Like, what is its first priority? And that's why we see a lot of like, I think, disagreement in like Ethereum, right? Is like it's gotten like very large, right? And there's benefits to that, right? And it's very decentralized, right? So that means you have different people who have different perspectives and different preferences, right? And so, when we think about, what should people kind of keep in their mind when they go to Astria, right? Like they should be conscious that like, decentralization, right? And this like unstoppability and the censorship resistance, that's like a priority for us, right? And so, that's going to have implications, both positive and negative, right? If someone comes to us and says, hey man, I'd really like to run like one sequencer and run it at, 100 millisecond block time or 200 millisecond block time or whatever the hell the 1 millisecond block time, the megas that people are saying, right? We're going to say like, look, that's not our priority, right? Our priority is to provide the highest performance, highest quality user experience while maintaining decentralization. And that's going to have fundamental trade-offs, right? But they also know if they say, hey, we're going to build something and we think, there might be opposition from a regulatory perspective, right? Whether it's, explicit or they just say, we don't think, regulators are going to be happy with this, right? Then I think, they're going to say, hey, look, that's going to be something that is like important to us to kind of support here, right? That is a use case that we want to be able to be used for. And that's one of the things that we think is like really, really important, is to be able to say, we're not kind of being like maximally cynical and extractive to say, hey, the only thing we care about is running a server and optimizing the hell out of like one box and running it as fast as possible, and then saying that's going to give you the highest quality product. You're like, yeah, sure. I mean, fucking Jane Street does that, right? But like there's a degree at which like I am not, trying to compete with Jane Street from like a performance perspective, right? We're working in a different place where we have kind of different requirements and different expectations, and we want our users to be aware of that kind of going in, right? And so I think that's something, again, by being kind of, Astria itself is like somewhat sovereign, right? We write all our data to Celestia, but fundamentally we have the ability to kind of define our own priorities for how we build things. And we think that's very, very important to kind of have people be aware of.
Absolutely. So you're coming up on time here. I have a couple last questions for you. One is, we touched on the origin of, you consider building the Solana ecosystem. Ultimately, you chose Celestia and the modular ecosystem. You're betting very heavily on it. But also, you gave a very famous talk now at Research Day earlier this year called "We Are All Building the Same Thing." So I'm curious, like how do you sort of reconcile those two opinions of like you're very Celestia opinionated, and believe that's you're doubling down and investing everything kind of in the Celestia ecosystem, but at the same time saying that every ecosystem is building the same thing. So what's sort of how does that add up?
Yeah, so again, it's like a question of like kind of like how abstract do you want to think about things, right? You say the same thing, right? You say, oh, we're all building distributed systems, right? We're all just building like, what they used to call it DLT, right? Like distributed ledger technology, something with some like broad terms. It's not just blockchains, it's distributed ledger technology or whatever, right? But I think, really when we think about, kind of who do I think are the players, right? Right now, I think the players really are, you have Solana and you have Ethereum and the roll-up ecosystem on top of that, and you have Celestia, right? And I think what we're all kind of shooting for, right, is, again, I love the Solana people. I have a large bag holder of Solana. I still like the Solana and respect the hell out of that community, right? I don't, unfortunately, have time to participate in multiple communities, right? And so I'm betting on Celestia as kind of my working hours in my professional career, right? But fundamentally, I think they have this good idea, right, of like, what are they put on like increasing throughput and reducing latency, right? And so to some degree, I think, again, like Mustafa's tweet this morning, right, was like, what are we trying to do? We're trying to create abundance, right? We're saying, hey, we think this ability to have this decentralized, censorship-resistant block space is good. We should try to just max out the supply of this, right? And so in a way, everyone's just saying, we're just trying to make like the highest throughput, right? And there's going to be nuances, right? Again, I think about like John Adler. He's like, it's an implementation detail, right? That's always what he's saying. You get a discussion with John. He's always going to, that's an implementation. That's his sales job, right? Punt that to the engineers. We're on the research side here. We're thinking in broad abstract terms. So I do think we're all trying to create these high throughput networks, but the implementation details and the path dependencies matter, right? Why I think kind of, what I wanted to get out of that talk, right? And I had this slide, right? Like I got viral or whatever, right? It was like, you stop gaslighting each other, right? It's stop trying to pretend about the differences between yourself. There are practical real world differences that have, implications on product and performance and user experience, right? And we should be aware of those, but also be aware when you're saying, look, you and that guy are trying to do the same thing. You're both doing things in decentralized and thus open source ecosystems. So maybe you can borrow some learnings from that, and the overall ecosystem as a whole can get better. Because what I don't want to see is some world where, we have one ecosystem that is the only ecosystem that has any kind of competitive product, and you have no competition. It just ossifies, right? It just is allowed to sit there and be stagnant. And I think you see a lot of the discussion in the Ethereum ecosystem right now, where they're like waking up, they're like, oh shit, the Solana guys are actually going to take our lunch because we just sat on our ass for like 3 years and like it didn't do anything. And the thing still was like mediocre. And now they're kind of trying to rapidly accelerate and kind of get back into it. And so I think it's good to say, look, there's similarities between these ecosystems. It's good to know the market you're in, and it's good to know who your competitors are so that you don't kind of like, sit on your hands and become kind of uncompetitive in the market. You got to know that you have competitors and you got to create a competitive product, right? And so when I think about kind of Celestia, again, my broadest category of separation of like Celestia and like Solana, how I think about it, Solana bit the bullet on big blocks. I think they've done phenomenally, right? They have like 1,400 validators, but they're running big blocks, right? They're running fast block times, but they bit the bullet and said, we're just going to solve the hard engineering problem and just get that throughput. What Celestia said is Celestia looked at, essentially, right, like a BitTorrent style torrent network, right? I think about it as like a BitTorrent with like a consensus protocol on top of it, right? Where it's saying we're going to create all this abundance and we're going to have, 1 million or 10 million or whatever light nodes in this network, and each of them is going to be able to contribute to the additive kind of amount of bandwidth in this overall network. And that's kind of two things, right? But fundamentally, you're trying to make a large network that is censorship resistant, that has high bandwidth, right? You can do that by trying to have a smaller number, but still is 1,400 nodes is a lot of nodes, right? But all of them are large, right? They cost, $10,000, $20,000 to run versus, Celestia having, 1 million or 1 billion light nodes, right? That are all contributing, right? Obviously a much smaller fraction of kind of the throughput to the network than like one node in Solana, but because you have more of them. But again, they're all in service of, we just want to have like max throughput on a censorship resistant network so we can have these unstoppable apps. And I think both are legitimate approaches. And I just bet on one, but I'm all in there, right? We've got 19 people now at Astria, which is, insane to say now, and it's been 3+ years of my life, with this kind of being the core focus of it. And we're just getting started, right? We just got our mainnet out. We got Flame out. Now things are kind of real, right? Now we can get real user feedback and actually kind of iterate on that to make, again, we want to be competitive, right? We want to make something better than Solana. We want to make something better than every roll up on Ethereum, right? We don't want to, kind of add, adjectives to say we're the best, but with qualifiers, right? We just want to build the best system. And we think Celestia gives us a foundation to build fundamentally, the best system in crypto for doing whatever it is people, in crypto want to do, whether that's, trading, whether that's lending, whether that's meme coins, whether that's NFTs.
Could not have said it better myself. Well, Josh, congrats again on the launch of Astria mainnet and on Flame. Forma has also been a huge success over the past few months. So what can people look forward to, as we close out? What's next on the roadmap for Astria? What do people have to look forward to in the coming month and in 2025?
Right. So we got Flame out, right? We always have Forma, big kind of practical things that are like, hey, these are just, tasks to do, right? So, we're going to bring, Forma onto Astria mainnet, right? And we think that's going to be a big milestone because it's going to mean that we have this, like, the shared sequence actually doing shared sequencing, right? We actually have two, but I'm assuming it's still working.
I can hear you. Kind of.
Okay.
Uh-oh. Josh's centralized sequencer went down. Josh.
Connection.
There we go. Well, I can kind of hear you. I'll give you like another minute, and if you come back, we can wrap up. Otherwise, I'll just close out. Oh, there you are.
Okay, sorry about that. I the co-working
Nice.
space Wi-Fi just decided to drop. So
little downtime, but we're back up.
Okay, well, we're just wrapping up, right? So like, what is next on like the roadmap for like Astria Flame Forma, right? So practically we're going to migrate Forma over to the Astria mainnet, right? And so we'll have Flame and Forma running on literally same validators, right? Same kind of like sequencing layer here. That'll be cool because it'll allow us to kind of, I guess like test and prod kind of things, right? Of saying like, okay, there's been a lot of academic discussion about, atomicity, synchronicity, right? Shared sequencing, right? What benefit from composability? We got to go test them out, right? Go make an app that says, hey, I'm going to be an app, a front end, right? And I'm going to do a thing, and that thing's going to interact with both Flame and kind of Forma. And actually see, like, is that actually a thing that creates kind of interesting product categories, right? I'm interested to kind of find that out. For Flame, right, relatively minimal kind of environment, right? Not really like a DeFi ecosystem, but we've got the kind of core assets here, right? We've got like a UniV3 clone, right? We're aware of some issues on the kind of front end here, right? Things with like ledger support, MetaMask, ledger support, and Kepler. So we have like a bug list of like stuff that we're just going to kind of be polishing now that we have a product out. That's going to take an amount of our time here. We're obviously kind of like a very MEV interested shop. A lot of my kind of like Nerd Snipey kind of stuff is MEV adjacent. So we have a product we're calling like the Astria Auctioneer. We're going to try to get that onto mainnet as soon as possible. Essentially, it's going to be a top of block auction. Again, similar to a lot of the past dependencies, right? When you look at PBS and Ethereum, it's selling the whole block. If you look at the kind of mechanics of it, right? By and large, it's the top transaction people want to buy, and they want to buy it for like a centralized exchange, decentralized exchange arbitrage. We're going to see what happens if we just auction off the top transaction, and our roll-up design allows us to have that option of just saying, look, it's just the top transaction, the rest of the block's normal, right? We're just going to auction off the top transaction, see what that is. So that's an interesting kind of having a kind of research in production thing, right? Having a MEV thing out there. That'll be interesting, get some feedback since we've been participating in those on like an academic discussion for a long time. In Oracle, we're going to integrate in Oracle and the Real Lending Protocol. We do think a large amount of demand from like a kind of business perspective is going to be, people want to get, the staking rate on Celestia. So we think they're going to do LSTs, but they're open to having, their LSTs, whether that's Stride, whether that's Milky Way, whether that's Drop, earning additional yield. So we think lending is kind of a potential market for that. People to take their LSTs, kind of lend that, borrow USDC, whatever. We're well positioned on that. So that's kind of one of the big next things we're looking at. Those are the more kind of immediate things. There's a lot of things that I would say are kind of behind the scenes things. So technical optimizations, right? Right now we're running 2.3 second block times. We haven't really spent any time trying to kind of like improve that. Practical sense, the means you just use Comet BFT, right? We just use Comet BFT. Now we're going to see, okay, what are the modifications we can make to Comet BFT or optimizations to our networking architecture, right? And we talked to, Evan Forbes from Celestia, who's done a lot of the great writing, right? Around kind of like vacuum and, various kind of optimizations you guys have made from, network propagation of blocks and transactions and et cetera. What can we do to reduce block times, right? Because we do think, people would prefer, slightly faster block times. I'm not sure how fast you want to get here, but there's definitely kind of low hanging fruit there. And that's more behind the scenes technical work, but all just making Astria itself kind of a platform that's better to kind of build on. And then related to that, we have a bunch of dev tooling. We really haven't marketed a lot of dev tooling. We have a very, very cool, command line interface, terminal user interface for running our network locally that we think actually provides a really good development experience that both the Forma and Flame guys, use to do their development. So we're going to market a bit of that and just generally kind of start ramping up our efforts on making Astria, an ecosystem that third parties can build on. Because to date, right, we focused more on kind of Forma and Flame being the primary kind of customer consumers of the sequencing layer, starting to kind of build up the resources, both on, whether it's like an individual DevRel, whether it's kind of like a customer support style kind of thing, whether it's a documentation, so that other people can actually build on top of Astria and start building out this broader ecosystem using the sequencing layer.
Beautiful. Yeah. Adding MEV support, adding oracles and continuing to dog food and debug and make the Astria sequencing layer even more like robust and dropping block times. These are all super exciting and clearly the future. And the cool thing, again, going back to what we talked about, you're already decentralized. So you have that checked off. Whereas I feel like, most other teams are kicking that down the road and may just, build up an extreme amount of tech debt before they, can really, get on top of that. So anyway, Josh, thank you so much for coming on. Congrats again on the launch. I saw your tweet. You said, in this moment, I'm euphoric. You deserve it. So congrats to you and the team, and looking forward to following you guys as Flame and Forma and the Astria ecosystem continues to grow.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nick. Appreciate you having me. And again, congrats to you on the anniversary of the Celestia mainnet. It's been great to be on this journey for all of these years.